and was ramping up.
The strength of the dollar is driving lots of outbound U.S. travel.
He said many Americans plan to head overseas.
We were looking at the numbers for this summer in Western Europe, and this is off the back of a record 2023. Our forward booking revenue is up about 7%, going into destinations like France, Italy, Spain, Greece. And I think the same is true for Asia.
And he said it's not just luxury travelers looking to get away.
We have, for the first time in our 97-year history, moved into the mid-scale tier, and that is a more value-focused customer. And they are absolutely traveling. They're just looking for a better value proposition.
Gina Cerbetti, Bloomberg Radio.
Now a sports update on Bloomberg 1130.
At Wimbledon, Barbara Krejcikova won Wimbledon, capping an unexpected run to her second Grand Slam singles title. The 28-year-old from the Czech Republic beat Jasmine Paolini of Italy. She won the French Open in 2021, but was seeded number 31 at Wimbledon. In baseball, the Yankees are in Baltimore to face the Orioles. Luis Gil against Grayson Rodriguez. Back to Bloomberg Sports, I'm Seth Everett.
Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Podcast Spotlight Hour on Bloomberg Radio.
You are listening to the All Thoughts Podcast on Bloomberg Radio. I'm Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal.
On today's show, we are taking a look at Embraer. How is it that this highly successful aircraft manufacturer came to be? And what does it say about the outlook for aerospace manufacturing right now? We're speaking with Richard Abulafia, Managing Director at Aerodynamic Advisory, and Juan David Rojas, Latin America columnist at Compact Magazine.
So you mentioned that by the time Embraer came into existence, Argentina already had an aviation company, FMA. Can you maybe give us the short compare and contrast version of why regional carriers in the U.S. are not flying on little planes made by FMA?
There's a lot more history to Embraer. Embraer went through a lot and saw a number of failures. But, you compare it to FMA and it's just night and day. Why? The FMA had that advantage. They started so many decades earlier. And this is to give you an idea. It was first created, I think, in 27 by secret decree. And as a result, if you can believe this, there are no audits or financial records from the Argentine government. And, another factor that's important, too, is the fact that Brazil, they had this 20-year military dictatorship, but comparatively, there was a lot more stability. That military dictatorship lasted a lot longer, and there was continuity between these dictatorial and democratic governments. In Argentina, during the 20th century, there were I think something like 30-something coups, and they had this effort during Germany, and apparently they didn't jive well with the Argentines. I have a few good data points on here that in just 5 years, 55 and 60, they went through 9 different directors with a maximum term of 23 months, and it was just extremely volatile. It was just a complete disaster. And in Embraer, the difference was that they really specialized in going after these small and later regional jets. That then the regional ones took off in the 90s after the company privatized. And they ended up privatizing FMA also in the 90s, and that was a complete disaster. It was run by Lockheed, and they promised to not lay off a ton of workers and made other promises, broke all of them, but the Argentine state still looked the other way.
Going back to Embraer, can you talk to us about, its role in the overall Brazilian economy? Because this is something I was thinking about. We did that episode with Ricardo Hausman where he was talking about how...
That episode is very much in the background of my mind.
Yes.
Exactly.
I listened to that one. That's really good.
And he was talking about, this idea that once a country develops one industry, it sort of leads to other industries where there are synergies or where that technological knowledge can be built upon. So I'm curious, were there other trees that Embraer actually led to within the Brazilian economy?
The military industrial sector had a number of different firms, and actually one that comes to mind right now, unfortunately, because it runs the risk of being acquired by a foreign company, Avibras, which specialized in making a number of military hardware. And the CTA, it was based out of São José dos Campos in the state of Sao Paulo. It's kind of known as Brazil's Silicon Valley. And that actually turned into this huge industrial hub. I believe Lula actually worked out of there when he was a union leader for Brazil's metallurgy union. Embraer is a pretty small company. It's worth only about, like $5 billion. Yeah. And unfortunately, what we saw after the 90s is that a lot of Brazil's industry in manufacturing really collapsed because of the fact that they liberalized trade and privatized a lot of these companies. Some of them did better, like Petrobras and Vale, for instance. But a lot of the indigenous auto manufacturing firms basically collapsed overnight, unfortunately.
So this touches on a couple of things and what I was going to ask next. But part of the question here is, like, what happened such that, A, like, how is there this one company that managed to overcome two very unlikely things happening? And B, is it just a matter of premature liberalization in your view? Or, like, what are the factors that cause that there aren't more Embraers? Why isn't there a Brazilian BYD or whatever it is?
As far as why Embraer succeeded, a lot of it is luck. A lot of it is just smart investments, really good competence, and cultivating talent for this company. But as far as why there isn't a Brazilian BYD, there's this automaker in Brazil, Gurgel. Its president was known as the Brazilian Henry Ford. And to be honest, most of the cars that this company made weren't great, but a lot of them had potential. They were actually making EVs during the 70s and 80s. They were these small little cars, and the Jeeps that they made were pretty good. Unfortunately, after they removed tariffs and allowed competition with imports in the 90s, the company went bankrupt in 1996. And we talk about premature liberalization. It's interesting because what I would argue with a company like that is that you don't want to just prop up these companies unnecessarily, especially if they're not giving results. But if there's potential there, things maybe would have been different if, let's say, policymakers have said, you know what, we don't want you to fail, but we want to see results. You need to gear your operation towards exports. And we're going to condition a lot of our support on increasing production, etc.
What's the new industrial policy in Brazil? I keep hearing about that, and I guess the big question is, when you say new industrial policy, how does that differ from the old industrial policy?
I believe it was earlier this year, unveiled what he called his new industrial plan. I think it was, I forget exactly the figure, including a bunch of subsidies, local content requirements, credit lines, in order to attract investment specifically in manufacturing. And actually the results so far are pretty good. Stellantis, BYD, Great Wall Motors, a number of key firms have opened up plants in Brazil, and the idea is to be able to benefit from that technology transfer. And it's one thing just that foreign multinationals are opening up plants in your country. Another is that you can really actually learn from them and then create your own firms.
There's been plants in Mexico for a long time, U.S. automaker plants, but Mexico does not have, as far as I know, a rising domestic auto industry of its own. What are the barriers? Why is it that in some cases, in theory, that works? You have some foreign automakers like Ford set up a plant, and then there's know-how, and then there's domestic building, and there's rising the value chain. And then sometimes you're still just basically capturing only a modest share of value as a place for end finishing, and it doesn't spread out.
Mexico is really today one of the few countries in Latin America that has a really robust manufacturing sector. But as you stated, it's all really just assembly. They just import inputs from abroad, assembled and finished goods and this is actually how a lot of the Asian titles started out. Taiwan, Singapore, etc. They started out assembling these goods and then exporting them, but they eventually graduated such to the point where they developed companies like Samsung, TSMC, the like. And exactly why that hasn't happened in Mexico, for instance, and other Latin American countries, it's hard to say. I think we could chalk it up to an extent to a lack of imagination, honestly.
So on that note, I mean, I know your expertise is Latin America, but do you think nowadays you could have a repeat of an Embraer in the sense that you could have, you know, a homegrown high-tech industry despite the idea that there are all these, you know, quite high barriers to entry, especially for something as complex as building aircraft?
Oof, that's a tough question because if it were to happen, it would take decades. And it would take decades for us to see a firm that's really successful. I meant to get into this. Embraer was really in crisis mode during much of the 80s and early 90s. Why? During the 70s, Brazil saw this huge boom, upwards of like 10% growth each year. And they were investing in all of these, you know, manufacturing companies, but a lot of that was financed with external debt. You get to 79, I believe, and Mr. Volcker and the Federal Reserve starts massively raising interest rates. This causes a huge crisis in Brazil that causes the country's debt to explode, and similarly affected a lot of other countries in Latin America. You guys might have heard the term the lost decade that refers to the 1980s. Interestingly, actually, in Brazil, up until like 85, the military, their view was that they could pay down some of their debt by promoting exports, and they ran these huge surpluses. Then after 85, they started more of an austerity regime. There was also a slump in the early 90s because of the Gulf War, and the company was given like a $500 million rescue package. But when it was finally privatized, it actually had to be put up for auction like 5 times because it was viewed as so undesirable.
So that's interesting. The Volcker shock sort of clobbering the economies of countries that had gone into debt to do domestic investment. You mentioned the Gulf War downturn, which I hadn't thought about. But after the military dictatorship ended, after 20 years, and then the company went private, like, what was the sort of policy stance of the government at that time? Was it a sort of classic Washington consensus, pursue that kind of liberalism? Like, what was the environment, the domestic policy environment during that sort of those rough years in the 80s and 90s?
You know, I think you could say it's a bit of both. The key thing is that when the company was privatized, the government kept what's called a golden share, giving them, you know, veto power over changes in ownership and really strategic decisions with regards to the running of the company. And it's really because of this golden share that the company is still a Brazilian company. Avibras, actually, which I mentioned before, was completely privatized. The government kept zero ownership, and it's because of that it runs the risk now of being sold off and no longer being Brazilian. They had this pre-privatization venture into, I think it was the ERJ, that really took off after privatization. There's all these interests in regional jets, but on the one hand, there was a more laissez-faire approach, but, you know, because aviation manufacturers, it's really necessary to have support from the government. I mean, you know, Boeing and the like, they're government contractors. The support that Embraer received from the Brazilian state was similar to its more developed peers, you know, that's still subsidized and the like.
This has been Odd Lots on Bloomberg Radio. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
To hear the rest of this episode and all of our interviews, be sure to subscribe to Odd Lots wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
From the financial capital of the world, broadcasting 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is WBBR New York, Bloomberg 1130. Now, a global news update.
Former President Trump is set to hold a rally later today in rural Pennsylvania. It will be his final campaign event before the Republican National Convention. Meanwhile, Trump has been fueling speculation about his choice for running mate. Talking about his short list on the Clay and Buck Show Friday, Trump noted South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, Florida Senator Marco Rubio, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum are among the top contenders. Trump said he'd love to announce his running mate during next week's Republican National Convention, but added he might do it as soon as Monday. President Biden is criticizing the right-wing Project 2025, saying it's been bought and paid for by Trump's supporters.
Project 2025 is the biggest attack on our system of government. Our personal freedom has never been proposed in the history of this country.
Project 2025 is a policy plan that details how Trump's allies plan to consolidate executive power, gut the civil service bureaucracy, and reshape the federal government if Trump wins a second term. In his speech in Detroit on Friday, Biden also took some shots at Trump himself, reminding the crowd of his recent fraud convictions and quoting a judge who found Trump liable of rape and defamation. Russia has lost more than 70,000 troops in Ukraine over the past 2 months, according to British intelligence. The UK's Ministry of Defense said Friday the numbers, which include killed and wounded, are expected to grow as Russia tries to advance across the front lines. Russian forces have been using grinding tactics against Ukrainian troops that are facing severe shortages of manpower and ammunition. Famed TV sex therapist Ruth Westheimer has died. With her thick German accent and matronly demeanor, she was known for being quite frank when advising couples on how to best improve their love lives.
A woman has to teach a partner how she needs to be touched. He can't know it just by wanting to be a good partner.
Dr. Ruth was 96. I'm Lisa Carton. Governor Greg Abbott is calling for an investigation into why so many Texans lost power after Hurricane Beryl made landfall Monday and why it's taking so long to get the lights back on. NBC's Priscilla Thompson reports that for the thousands of people still without power, the misery is real.
Guy and Ruth say they tossed $600 in spoiled food. I don't know. The couple says they pawn their wedding rings to buy gas so they can drive between long lines at food distribution sites and cooling centers with their 3 grandchildren in tow.
The governor is focusing on CenterPoint Energy, which has operated in the area for over 100 years. At least 4 people have died because of heat and power loss. As it stands today, nearly 700,000 customers are still without power in the region. Officials say an American Airlines flight had to be evacuated after the cabin filled with smoke. Jim Forbes has more.
The flight was getting ready to leave San Francisco International Airport on Friday when crew members reported smoke in the cabin. American Airlines says the smoke was coming from a laptop in a passenger's bag. There were reportedly 3 minor injuries. The FAA says it will investigate. I'm Jim Forbes.
A Long Island man was indicted Friday for cutting off the ears of his injured dog and using glue to try and close its wounds. Andrew Whitman reports.
34-year-old David Iglesias of Bellport is charged with animal cruelty, torturing and injuring animals, and cutting the ears of a dog, which is a crime. In November 2022, prosecutors say Iglesias' other dog attacked Neva, a 13-year-old female. He treated Neva by cutting off her ears and using glue to try to close the wounds. By the time he did bring Neva to a vet, septic shock had set in and Neva had to be put down.
An autopsy showed she suffered repeated wounds, especially to her limbs. I'm Lisa Carton.
And I'm Denise Pellegrini in the Bloomberg Newsroom. We're tracking military developments in the Middle East because Israel says it targeted a Hamas military commander in a massive strike in the crowded southern Gaza Strip. The Hamas military commander, according to Israel, who was being targeted is Mohammed Deif, believed to be by many the chief architect of the October 7 attack that killed some 1,200 people in southern Israel and triggered the Israel-Hamas war. Deif has topped Israel's most wanted list for years. President Biden vowing to keep up the fight for re-election.
I am running, and we're going to win.
Biden in a Michigan stump speech, also outlining his planned first 100 days in a second term and making some of the bluntest attacks on rival Donald Trump's legal troubles to date. A growing number of Democrats, though, calling on President Biden to leave the 2024 race on concern about his age following last month's debate performance. Among those suggesting Biden should step aside, Connecticut Congressman Jim Hines. He says he based his decision on feedback from people in his district in recent polls.
I've been watching the folks that say now the House of Representatives, which I thought we were going to win in November, is very much at risk.
Hines also says he hasn't heard from the White House since coming out against Biden. Billionaire Elon Musk throwing his support behind Trump, the richest person in the world, donating to a super political action committee working to elect a former president at the White House. Sources telling us Musk has contributed a sizable amount to a low-profile group called America PAC. Two Republican billionaires who have criticized Donald Trump recently each met with the former president. More on what happened there from Bloomberg's Ed Kalecki.
Ken Griffin and Paul Singer, Republican billionaires who have criticized Donald Trump, met with the former president to discuss donating to his White House bid. This according to people familiar with the discussions. Neither Singer nor Griffin has made any